Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of Finance and Corporate Services Committee. We'll get right into it. Could I get a mover for the consent items, moved by Councillor Galloway-Sealock, Councillor Gazzola?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions on the first two items.
The first two items? Okay, Councillor Gazzola is moving that items 1 and 2 be moved out. Those in favor and opposed, that carries. Councillor Gazzola, when you're ready.
Yeah, we can deal with both of them together. I just have a few queries. I noticed in 2017, we got $723,000 from the province, and in 2018 that was cut to $476,000. What has happened there?
Ms. Farrell?
In 2016 and 2017, we had a project called Digital Innovation Skills Development Project, and that ended in 2017.
Okay, so that was just a one-time project.
Yeah, it was a one-year project.
Okay, now going along the same lines, in 2019, we're showing provincial income of $587,000, and then it's dropping off to $456,000. Is that again a similar situation? Or?
Yeah, so for the first 3 months of 2019, we're in 2 different agreements with the province. So there would be some revenues coming in during those 3 months.
So you're on a fiscal arrangement as opposed to a calendar year?
We're on the Ontario calendar year for our agreements.
Mr. Bloom, do you want to add?
Through the chair, just to add, we are anticipating, though, a financial cut from the province this year. Every small business center has been hit in various degrees, and this is just part of the province's fiscal approach this year. So that is part of the reason for the reduction.
But we're signing an agreement now with them. Does that freeze the amount for the next 3-year period? Or is it subject to further change?
So it's a fixed amount over the next 3 years. However, in the past, there have been times when the province increased the amount of funding. So they may have a bit of a surplus for the small business centers, and then we might get a small increase.
Okay. The region of Waterloo contribute $50,000 a year. Do they not recognize inflation? Is there no change coming from them?
No, it's been a fixed amount for a number of years.
Have we considered asking them for more?
So our agreement with them comes up 2021, so we'll pursue that at that time.
Okay, the reason I'm asking these questions is a very good program, an excellent program. I don't have any concerns about it, but I'm concerned that, are the Kitchener taxpayers picking up a bigger portion of the pot than they should be. Now, I look at on 2.3, you do show the sort of activity, and it's centered around Kitchener, but for example, there were 43,000 inquiries. Of 39,000 of them are classified under Kitchener. Are those all people from Kitchener, or are they from all over the region?
Oh, they could be from all over the region. And then remember, too, that in the satellite offices of Waterloo and Cambridge, they only have 1 staff person, whereas in Kitchener, we typically have about 4 or 5.
But we're answering questions for everybody across the region.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Rabinovich.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the report. I just want to follow up with respect to Councillor Gazzola's initial questions and the provincial funding, because this is something that some of my colleagues have talked about in their municipalities, as you pointed out, Corey. So when we look at the provincial funding, the reason in 2019 we saw a larger amount was because it was based on the old agreement prior to the reductions that have been attributed
to
us.
Yeah.
And so really the amounts for fiscal 2019-20, 2021, and 21-22 is 456,000?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And we don't anticipate further reductions? This is sort of what our share of it has been at this point? Or what's the word on the street?
That's the word on the street, yeah. We don't expect any further reductions.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are no further questions. I'd just like to add that I did notice in these documents, historically, there's been questions about more financial information. I noticed that you anticipated that and included the extra information here, so I just wanted to acknowledge that, then I appreciate it. Unless I hear any objections, we'll take all three of these together. Okay, those in favor? And that carries unanimously. Okay, we'll get into item number 4, participatory budgeting debrief. Mr. Haggie.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the Council, staff are not intending to make any presentation about participatory budgeting. We do have Sean Goby, who's part of the University of Waterloo team. He will be making a short presentation here. And I would just like to point out he has another engagement that he has to get to, so he needs to leave by 11. So it would be our preference if we can deal with questions kind of for him and his side of things first, and then if there are questions of staff, we could deal with them after.
Very good, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Council. So thank you for the opportunity to come and speak in front of you today. As I think we all know, university-community collaborations tend to be very difficult. University-city collaborations, even more so and rare. We have different time horizons that we're often working under, different incentive structures that underpin our collaborations. And so this is really the outcome of a conversation, an agreement that started in September of 2016. And I wanted to start off by just thanking you as a council and as a city for the vision to engage in a project like this. And I did want to also specifically thank a few people who, from both the city side and the university side, have been really vital in making this happen. There have been many staff people and councillors who've been involved from the beginning, but I did want to thank a couple of staff people in particular who we've worked with very closely over these couple of years, Dan Chapman, Ryan Hagee, Jeanette McDonald, and Dan Ritz for their work in helping make this a successful and engaging pilot. From the University of Waterloo side, Vic DeCiccio and Mario Coniglio, who were quite vital in having this original agreement kind of come forward. And the research team, who I've worked with quite closely over this, Pravjot Sangha, Sean Campbell, who many of the staff here have worked with, and Norman Kearney, who just over 2 years ago, and the first time the UW research team was presenting to City Council, was actually presenting in my stead because my child had been born about a week earlier, and so Norman was generous enough to step in and fill that gap. And so, as I said, there's a testament to the hard work of people in this building, at the university, and in this entire community that we were able to have these 2 successful participatory budgeting pilots. And just as a bit of context for where this fits in the broader scheme of these types of engagements, this is really the first step towards bringing a 30-year-old process to the City of Kitchener. Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989 was where we first saw this, and really has, in terms of the scale of the population involved and the size of the city budget involved, is really quite far down the road there. In Porto Alegre, about 10% of the city's annual budget is allocated according to participatory budgeting methods, and although it varies year to year, usually about 5% of the city's population is actively involved in making the decisions in any particular budgeting cycle. Now, since the first PB process in Porto Alegre 30 years ago, this is a process that's spread around the world to over at least 2,000 local governments throughout the world in more than 40 countries, and North America has actually been one of the slower places for uptake of these sorts of processes. We are not the first in Ontario to have attempted participatory budgeting processes. Guelph, Hamilton, the City of Toronto, and Toronto Community Housing Corporation have all undertaken participatory budgeting projects in the past. But one of the pieces that really motivated our side of this work from the university was that those processes have, to a greater or lesser degree, often been either abandoned or really scaled back over the course of their delivery. And our feeling was that much of this probably has to do with real questions about how those processes were designed. Were they designed in ways that were really engaging the community at their best? Were the decision-making processes ones that fully took those different perspectives and opinions into account? And there have been a lot of changes in how participatory budgeting has been undertaken from that initial starting point in Porto Alegre to other parts around the world, to North America, to Ontario, and even to Kitchener. And so we were in a lot of ways much more modest in what we were looking for out of this. We were looking to test a couple of particular elements of the participatory budgeting design process. And from my side of things, it was most important that we had these pilots happen. That we're dealing with a few difficult things. We're dealing with public engagement, we're dealing with city-university collaboration, and we're dealing with a new process all at the same time. And these are first steps for how to build a long-term infrastructure of revitalized citizen engagement here in Kitchener, and to really contribute to that wider conversation about how this happens in our community, across the country, and around the world. And so that, I think, is some context that I wanted to highlight going into our conversation about the reports that came from our team at UW and from the city staff. We did learn some things that I think are certainly relevant long-term to this community. The key pieces which I do want to highlight are that we definitely saw that the results generated by participatory budgeting in the two park pilots were substantially different than what we would regularly see coming out of just the standard staff-led engagement. The design bundles that the residents ended up voting for were ones that they had actually voted to create, so lending more credibility to the strength and the decision-making prowess of those neighbors and being able to decide what pieces of infrastructure they would see in their parks. And finally, that there was a substantial increase in the participation of residents. Now, still, between the two sites and the two rounds of voting, between 1.25 and 2.5% of the population, our estimates at least of the population of those communities ended up voting in the process. And I will say that seems to be quite a substantial improvement over what we'd usually see. And it seems to have really grounded some interesting conversations and real support for what these parks will look like going forward. Now, I want to be relatively brief there to leave it for questions and discussion because there's a lot of material to digest here, and I would like to be available as a resource this morning as you go forward. Thank you.
I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you. And there are a number of questions for you. So remember, questions only of the delegation for now, okay, everyone? Beginning with Councillor Marsh.
Thank you, Chair Davey. So, Sean, I just wonder, from the lessons learned that you were able to find through this pilot, would you say that the university is still willing to continue partnering going forward in additional projects?
Thank you, Councillor. Absolutely. I will say that the thanks at the beginning were quite heartfelt. It was a pleasure working with the city. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there is plenty of room for additional process design and improvement here. And we are certainly open to exploring what that could look like.
So the budget for the parks was perhaps too small to begin with. That's arguable, but I noticed that the budget did have to increase, and you did note some of the potential reasons for that. Would you see that going forward, should we continue with a partnership, that you would be able to partner in finding ways for efficiencies to decrease that, that amount?
Good question. So I'd say that there's really two pieces that are tied to that. One is just simply a lack of experience, and this is from both our side and from the city side as well. And as we would have more time working with this, the city staff are going to get better at actually estimating what the costs are for a process like this. People are also going to have more experience doing it, so we'll be able to do it quickly, more efficiently, in a more streamlined manner. So there is that aspect that I am certain would go down in terms of the cost. But as was also identified, there are some pieces that are inherently a bit more difficult than a standard process. It does take more time. And so that does have to be taken into account. At this point, I can't give you a good count as to how much of the cost is just simply this learning curve piece and how much is just irreducibly because this is a more engaged process. Okay. But absolutely, I would see this kind of going down.
Okay, terrific. I was really pleased to see the list of additional city services that might lend themselves to fit well with participatory budgeting. So going forward, I look forward to seeing you again, with additional projects. And at the appropriate time, I'd like to move the recommendation.
Very good, thank you. Next is Councillor Gazzola.
Can you tell me which color were the city's staff's recommendations? I just want to compare with what we ended up with and where we started.
Yes, good question. I am going to open up to the right page so that I can. Fortunately, I printed it in black and white, so I'm happy that we did in fact label them red, green, and blue. So for the Elmsdale, I believe it was the yellow bundle, was the city staff bundle. And for Sand Hills, I don't remember exactly. I believe it was the blue bundle that was the staff recommendation for Sand Hills.
Okay. When we're speaking of the cost here, I assume that the cost was the cost of doing the work after a decision is made. You're talking about the cost of the process. How many person hours would have been involved in the process, and not counting volunteer hours, not counting the people, but how many paid person hours were involved in this process?
So I can speak only to the cost that was involved from the University of Waterloo side. So this was the $40,000, $20,000 coming from the City of Kitchener, $20,000 coming from the University of Waterloo. That went to our team, largely or almost entirely, to pay for the research assistants. Though I will also note that a lot of that work would not be kind of standard to the process. It was academic research on top of that. In terms of the staff, estimates of staff time, that I would have to leave to city staff.
Okay, so what you're telling me, this process, this pilot here cost us $48,000, plus there could be more staff time.
So this pilot cost the $40,000, well, of the $40,000, 20 came from the City of Kitchener, so it was $20,000 from the City of Kitchener, in addition to whatever additional staff time would have been involved. Certainly the comparison there would have to be between the staffing time involved in this process versus the amount of staffing time that would be involved in the standard engagement process, though it certainly would be more staffing time for this.
Okay, well, nonetheless, it was $48,000 $48,000 plus. Now, that's not where you go from 100 to 150,000, is it? Is that what, no, the 100 to 150 is when you put a price on these different topics, the residents ended up with 150. So it's interesting to see now when you, with the sort of somewhat staff recommendation, there were 3 projects and the people went for 10. So it's hard to compare, you know, what is better. It is difficult to comprehend, though, a 50% overrun on our budget without taking into account the process, and then we have to go out and tender that, which budgets and tenders don't always come in at the same price. Just to close up here, I'm running out of time. Can you give me 3 factors as to why this is better than the normal public engagement process that we go through?
Sure, Councillor. So I'd say the number one would be that if the bundles actually better represent what it is that the residents around these parks are interested in, then they end up with a better designed park out of it, which would likely lead to more park usage and better value for money for that community. A second piece is that these really did help create community conversations. People in these neighborhoods were talking about how to set priorities with each other and with city staff. And the third piece is an additional layer of transparency. The decisions that they were being brought to and constraints they were set with are similar to what you see around the table.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Gobi, for coming in and presenting this. As Council knows, partnerships with our post-secondary institutions is something that I've really talked about, and I'm really excited to see this. I think this is an amazing step forward and something that I really want to see us continuing with. And Councillor Marsh actually asked the questions that I was interested in asking. So, really, I wanted to get, I guess, more information on how you can see tweaking this in the future, how we can move forward with this. Maybe if you want to make some comment about that.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor. So one of the key limitations of this is that we really only had the pilot in 2 sites. And so because of that, we were really only able to test one particular design question, which was about the voting systems that we were using. And really, in each site, we were testing different things. And so because of that, the recommendations we can make as to what sorts of voting systems to use are limited. We don't know if what seemed to work well in these sites is more generalizable, because we've only really done one in each. So there is more space to even just do that basic piece of the voting system testing. But beyond that, we did this for one particular type of project, which was a park refurbishment, which was a relatively small-scale capital infrastructure project. We weren't talking about ongoing program spending. We weren't talking about moving funds between large level budget lines. And we were talking in terms of dollar amounts at $100 up to eventually $150,000 in each park, relatively small compared to the overall budget for the city of Kitchener. So all that said, there are some specific pieces in terms of design that we can continue to work with further on the voting model, but then also into elements of greater community engagement, greater community kind of ownership and design of what the process looks like from their side of things, and then also to different contexts, including different departments, different types of engagements, different sizes of budget, different geographic scope of community under consideration.
Thank you. While democracy does take time, it takes some effort, it takes some testing with processes, but I absolutely think that that you're on to something really great here. And to Councillor Gazzola's part, in terms of the funding model, I'm wondering if this is something that in the future we could get more students involved in, and that might actually save some costs both at the university level and at the city level. So that might be something that we can really take a look at in the future.
Yes, absolutely. And as actually one follow-up, I do currently have a master's student in planning who is doing her thesis work on participatory budgeting. She was actually interested about parks accessibility, and so she's going to be writing her thesis using these two sites as her case study.
That's amazing, and I can really see this as being a model that you'll be able to move across the province and the country. So I'm really excited about it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Councillor Schneider?
Thank you, Chair Davey. Thank you so much for coming in. An excellent report. And one thing that I think is important when we spend tax dollars is the value that we get back for them. How would you rate the value of the tax dollars spent in this process, in this pilot?
Good question. So I think we'd want to look at this almost in two different tracks. One is in terms of the actual sites themselves, the two parks, and I would say that it's, again, early phases right now. I would say probably quite good, particularly if we end up with parks that are better used, have the equipment that's better appropriate for the residents in Sandhills and Elmsdale neighborhoods. I could say you could almost certainly make a good case for that. The other piece, which is the actual pilot and the research and experimentation part, that's a little trickier to say. I mean, ultimately, this is research and development. This is R&D spending. This is the spending on what vision we have for the community and public sector innovation within it. And that's something that, depending on where you stand, can be very high or very low. What I think this work has done is it's really put the City of Kitchener on the leading edge of what public engagement looks like in North America. So over the summer I had conversations with people involved in participatory budgeting in different parts of the world, and no one has seen a process like what we did here. Even though it's small scale, that we did these 2 rounds of voting, that we tried out different mechanisms, we're the first place anywhere in the world, as far as I've been able to find, that's taken that approach. And I think what that means is that, you know, if we think there's value of being seen as a visionary community, then I think that's high value indeed.
Okay. Now, this one may be, tough to answer. Just it's maybe the ability to measure the satisfaction of those who participated in this and their ability to be kind of maybe a neighborhood ambassador for spreading the news about the new parks and just how things were done. I think there's value in that for as people feel. I mean, they'll be able to say this is our park.
I believe there absolutely would be value in that. Doing so in a degree of depth that I think would allow us to make very strong kind of findings on that was a little outside the scope of this research project. But I do believe that this is something that should be done going forward in those direct asks, but also indirectly too. Once the parks are fully constructed and we actually see in those neighborhoods how readily they're used, that's also going to be a piece of how satisfied they are. And you are city councillors around the table. If you hear back from people in your neighborhood that this is a process that engages them, I think that's going to be another way to find out as well. But of course, further research I think would suggest in the future that that's a piece we do collect a little more information on up front.
Great, thank you. I can't wait to see it expanded to other areas. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman?
Sorry. Thank you, Sean. When I heard that we were doing participatory budgeting in the city, I was very excited. I think it's a model that is worth replicating, the Porto Alegre model. And you and I have talked about this, right? And some of the variations of participatory budgeting. This sounds terrible, but I'm somewhat pleased to see that what staff would have proposed for these two parks was not what the people wanted. And I say that because I think what it demonstrates is that community engagement is very important. So, you know, and as you pointed out, the Porto Alegre model took 10% of their, I take it, their full budget. What are the chances of, like, how effective do you think it would be in Kitchener? And I'm not talking 10% because I think that would be a stretch for us at this stage. Maybe not for some of us, but for generally speaking. But could we talk about 2% of, say, the capital budget that we would set aside for participatory budgeting? So we're not tied to $150. And what this would allow to do would be to do greater outreach and not focus in on any particular project, like, say, two parks, but say, you know, maybe a community doesn't want their park renovated at all. Maybe they want speed bumps in their neighborhood, or maybe they want a dog park, or whatever the case may be. So it would then be people sort of leading the way within the constraints of that budget, and then they would decide which projects would fit within that percentage of the budget that has been set aside. So do you see this as something that's workable, or a next steps, or where do you see that sort of, what I'm trying to do is draw more on the Porto Alegre idea.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. So, can I imagine a vision where 2% of the city's budget or capital budget went this way? I could certainly imagine that. I think we have seen that in different cities around the world. Again, we've gone up to 10% in Porto Alegre. There's some smaller communities that have gone up to 15%, but those are much smaller than Kitchener. I would say that the one note of caution is it takes time to get there. And that my one worry about going too big too fast would be the risk that the kind of sophistication of the way that we deal with that as researchers, as residents, as staff, that we don't trip over ourselves getting there. All that said, I do think there's substantial scope for being able to expand this, both in the more narrow kind of lines, like we did with the parks refurbishment, so specific neighborhoods or specific kind of line items or budgetary places, as well as a more kind of global process. That said, I think those niche areas are probably the ones where it's easier to do kind of process experimentation, figuring out what are the methods that work best in those given circumstances, whereas the larger ones that are a little more general will, I think, want to take kind of the best practices of what we learn and not really stray too far from them.
Okay, then I guess what suggestion I might have, if we're not going to go the full, percentage of the budget route, rather than the city picking parks, could we pick an area, like a neighborhood area, or I don't know what the boundaries would be, and just say, okay, if you had $500,000, well, we maybe don't want to go that high, but what do you want to spend it on? What would you spend it on? So rather than us coming in and saying, we want to do some work in your park, take it on a smaller scale, but throw it out there. Would that be something you think would be worth considering at this next step?
I think that would be an excellent idea. I think that something that is more general kind of budget with a geographic kind of constraint to it, I think is potentially quite transformative in the number and variety of people who could be really engaged in the process. One of the limitations about parks is that there are really certain demographic ranges which are heavy park users. And so the engagement is going to be a little more constrained around them. The broader constraints, the broader community that could be brought in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Rabinovich.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Sean, for all of your work and that of your colleagues on this. I know, certainly the Porto Alegre model is widely touted in participatory budgeting circles, and seeing how we can make it apply here has certainly been interesting. I guess a couple questions, and first of all, building on where Councillor Chapman was going with her question, and you, I think, partially touched on it around geographic constraints being important. I look at something like this and think, I mean, it would seem to me it would be a difficult thing to, particularly if you have a limited amount of resources, to run on a ward basis, as an example, because, obviously, if you go out and start polling people in one part of the ward may want traffic calming. People in another part of a ward may look at something totally different. And so it would become, I think, challenging to tackle it in that kind of large context. Wondering if you can comment on that at all, and how others have dealt with this.
Sure. So in terms of how others have dealt with this, one of the things that actually makes the Porto Alegre model a bit different than how participatory budgeting has tended to be adapted in North America and Canada is that it is much more of a general kind of the entire city is involved in the process. And being able to do that with a level of geographic nuance and different communities being involved doesn't just involve having a great deal of kind of sophistication on the city staff side. It also does involve a lot of building of civil society organizations and networks to be able to make sure that different populations are able to remain engaged. Which, again, this is what happens when 30 years have been going according to this process, is some of that infrastructure gets developed. And I certainly, as engaged as residents of Kitchener are, we haven't had a generation of doing these models to be able to build all that infrastructure. That said, the specific piece that we were actually testing here in these pilots about looking at the different voting systems was in part to deal with some of those issues. So the voting systems, I don't want to get too into the weeds of voting details because we could be here all day doing that, all week really. But one of the aspects of the voting systems that we tested was systems that were particularly good at giving individual voters a good kind of direct consequence of their vote being out there. So, for example, the voting system that ended up producing the result people voted for in Elmsdale Park was one where basically, if there's roughly 100 voters, $100,000 spent, every voter was almost directly had $1,000 that they contributed to different projects. And so if you could think of expanding that to like a ward style kind of level, geographic scope, if there's a piece that's really important to people living at one intersection or on one block, and they all vote for that and prioritize it, they can probably get that without really just radically disrupting the allocations in the rest of the ward. So in terms of the geographic scalability, that's part of the reason that the voting design was actually really central to what we were testing here, because I do think that allows us to have something that's a bit more scalable, both geographically and with the number of people involved.
One of the other questions I have, because I mean, fundamentally, I certainly, I've been keen about this project and keen to see how and where it's relevant for the city. But I'm also, looking at how do we balance it against, sometimes some of the bigger priorities that maybe aren't seen as, for lack of a better word, as sexy by the general population. And wouldn't necessarily get ranked by them, and yet as a community we know that we need a certain amount of X, Y, and Z around the community for the overall quality of life of our residents. You know, and maybe some of that evolves over time, as you've suggested, as society sort of starts becoming more familiar with this over a generation and a half. But does that not sort of play out as a problem in some of these communities that have gone down that route?
Generally not, but that's because even at their most expansive, the largest participatory budgets are between 10 and 15%. So it's still the vast majority of the spending power is with the cities there. Yeah, but you know, that again is really at the mandate for the council to decide how much you go down that path.
And the last question I have is with respect to the 4-30, where you listed a number of outside public engagement processes and so on. You know, priority setting by elected councillors, volunteer-led granting committees, staff engagement and innovative cross-department initiatives and so on. Are there examples in the Canadian or North American context where folks have gone that far, or is this sort of things we've seen more in Europe and South America?
For a lot of these are things that just sort of were my observations being involved with this project and staff here.
Okay.
So generally what we see elsewhere are those kind of global budgets that are either geographically constrained or to the entire city, or we see budgets aligned to certain demographics, for example, students or young people or old people, or we see really narrowly defined topic areas. But some of the mechanisms that we are kind of using for participatory budgeting in these pilots, it just sort of seemed to me that there might be a wider range of applications even than just what we see elsewhere in the world too.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Sean. I think this is, as of others have said, an awesome opportunity where we absolutely do need to continue to explore, especially if you can utilize through partnership expertise in a academic perspective, through research, to better implement our processes and how we can improve our community. Why would we not try to endeavor in that path? But at the same time, I think through Mayor Vavanovic's comments or his question, he touched on that there needs to be a cautious approach, and at the same time, looking at ways to improve the process further than what we've done already. And as being a member of council who was fortunate to have an area that was picked as the original participatory budget pilot project, there's some things that came out of it, although it worked well, that still are missing, and I want to add my perspective and hopefully hear your comment. So the things here that were added were well led by those that participated and came out. But again, all of us around the table know that there continues to be, unfortunately, a very large silent majority that unfortunately are quite content in paying their taxes, going and working and hoping that the leadership in government picks and chooses and does the right thing that improves their life. So when we have those voices missing, and the personal context to this is in the Chandler-Mowat neighborhood, although much of the consultation happened at the community center, where there's a lot of density around, and youth were being able to participate, which is wonderful. The area in that neighborhood that was being picked, Elmsdale, also there's dense development that is more catered towards seniors or senior demographic. And through obviously being a representative of that area for some time now, I've heard need and want of more trails or a walking track in Elmsdale. Mm-hmm. When you have pieces like that missed, how do we ensure that there's a better way of capturing the wider voice and ensuring that it's an enhancement to what we would have done as opposed to an alternative to what we would have done? So that we know what maybe the needs are and we try to implement them, but then we enhance that, improve it based on public feedback through the participatory process.
Good question, Councillor. So I would say there's a couple of pieces here. So one is in terms of the process and the way that communities are engaged with, or that staff engage with the communities. I think that is an issue with both the traditional consultation process as well as the participatory budgeting process, is making sure that the full range of diverse voices in the community are brought in. Now, part of that can be just sort of, again, as the staff builds capacity and how to do that process. Some can be additional process experimentation. One approach that we certainly did not take a look at here, but I think potentially could play a role in some future iterations, is actually mobilizing a citizen jury in the community that's randomly selected to play a role in providing some of that guidance and feedback. One of the pieces that did come out of this, which was actually built in as part of the research design, but and so it wasn't something that I had anticipated would have longer term value beyond the pilot, but I have since kind of come to the conclusion that I think it does have a lot of long-term value, is the way we did a 2-round voting process in each park, where we had not just the vote for the prioritization and a bundle getting selected, but we in fact had multiple bundles, because I think what that can allow us to do longer term, having that final selection between bundles, is that if there does seem to be a community group that's missed, if there do seem to be stakeholders who were left out, if there were some real kind of glaring gaps in terms of infrastructure that's needed, that is a time where, you know, bundles other than those that came out through that initial voting process can be introduced, which then leads to another round of community engagement and voting that can mobilize more people. We in fact saw something like that in Sand Hills, where the second round turnout was actually higher than the first round turnout.
So I'm hearing the answer is we need to make sure that the effective communication. And one way is that through different rounds of voting, is that when we're coming to a more clear vision of what the community or those involved are recommending, not just put out a notices saying that there's another round happening, but send specific detail and saying this is what's being recommended. So do you, if you don't agree, come out, or if you have an alternative or support, still come out. Is that what's being approached?
I would say that is absolutely something that more of and better communication is part of it. But I think making sure that the power still ultimately rests in the hands of the residents of the neighborhood is, I think, where was really critical in making sure that these processes have legitimacy with the community going forward.
Just one minor question.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Singh, he has to leave in 9 minutes, and Councillor Michaud and I still have questions, if you don't mind. So, Councillor Michaud.
Thank you, Councillor Davey. Thank you for this report. It is very interesting and certainly very in-depth. I just want to make comments, actually, that I think by looking at all the data that you've supplied here, this is just going to give this community a more sense of ownership among all the different neighborhoods, and it's also going to, I think at the end of the day, elevate community engagement. I know that sometimes when we go to have these meetings at different areas that the turnout is quite small, and I think that something like this, through what Councillor Singh said, more promotion and more information out there in the community, I think this will certainly elevate the community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a couple questions before we go for round two, and I'm cognizant of your time. I know it's close to 11. To be clear, I'm a little bit of a skeptic on this, less of a skeptic than I once was, if that's any consolation, but just a couple of questions on the success of this. The $100,000 original budget, if this was left to staff, would they have come in that budget? Is that what you're saying here, or was it a result of this process that it became 150?
That's not something I can really answer. I don't see any particular reason why that would be a different amount, but maybe the staff might have a different perspective on that.
Okay, but are you aware of, like, was it a result of this process, the public participatory budget process, that increased the budget?
I don't think there was anything about this process itself that would necessarily increase the budget. The staff provided the estimates of what the costs of the individual items were, and so the budget bundles that were put together were all based on staff estimates.
Okay. In terms of I understand that the ultimate choice was different than the staff bundle, which is definitely interesting. Is there a way of assuring, like, I'm not sure, looking at the report, like, how do we know, though, that the perception, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what's the balance between having people involved in this process and the happiness and the way that end result is versus a park just they show up one day and there's a new park there that the city put in. Like, was there in your research, has there ever been like a control group sort of situation where a playground went in and there was research done initiated by the city versus the participatory budgeting process?
So the closest thing we really had to do in control group was actually having that staff design bundle included in that second round.
Okay, so in a perfect world, that actually would have been built somewhere, and we would have been able to survey both afterwards, right?
Potentially.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I'll have questions of staff afterwards. We have 3 people in the queue, and our delegate has to leave in about 6 minutes, so if you could keep your questions brief, I would appreciate it. Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, quick question that I forgot to ask, and you somewhat answered it. There were 15 categories. Was there a cost applied to each one of those categories?
So you mean, sorry, 15, you mean the individual items?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So in the kind of round 2, which was that prioritization vote, for each of the items, there was a dollar amount estimated by staff that was on the ballot.
And the people were aware of that dollar?
Yes, they were.
Okay, well, I'm curious as to why you didn't bring some reality into the exercise and say, we've only got 100,000, what do we do? That's what we have to end up doing. Why didn't we go that next step? That here's where the test is.
Well, ultimately, that was what the vote was for, is that the way that the voting worked was that the votes of the 100 or so voters at each park were aggregated, and that's what allocated those $100,000.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Noted. Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, just a question. Maybe it's not fair to ask you this, but if you were to set a dollar value moving forward for the next round of participatory budgeting, what would you recommend?
Good question. So, I mean, I think I would have a hard time putting exactly what that is, because I think it would depend really on the scoping. That said, at this point, we were looking at 2 pilots, $100,000 apiece, at least initially, where in terms of the external support that was coming in from the University of Waterloo, that was a total cost of $40,000 attached to it. It's a very high cost for engaging in that design. So I would think, to be at the point where we're looking at more than 10% of the total value of the budget going towards the additional cost of administering it, that strikes me as quite high. And so the 2 ways you can deal with that are cutting the amount that comes from folks like myself, but also the additional staff time. But certainly the other way is to increase the size of the budget being allocated as well. So an exact amount I would have a hard time pinning. I certainly could see, the hundreds of thousands easily. That's what we've already done, in the millions, certainly. I wouldn't be putting $100 million on the table. I think that would be quite the stretch. But to think about what the balance is between the amount allocated and the resources that go into the process, I think is really the key consideration there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, Councillor Singh to finish up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, Sean, do you support and recommend for us to touch base back with the community once improvements are made to ensure that, so for future projects, that we're getting it right?
Absolutely. I think that when it comes to the design of these processes that's best going to serve future communities, the best focus group we have, the best sample we have, are the people who've already gone through it. So I would absolutely think reaching back to the residents around Elmsdale and Sandhills would be advisable.
Good. Thank you.
Mayor Rubenich? No. There are no further questions. Really appreciate the work on this, Mr. Gable, and hopefully we'll be able to do something going forward.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we get into comments, actually, is there any, if you want to queue in, if you have any questions of staff, I know that I have a few questions of staff. I'm not seeing anyone. Councillor Singh of staff?
So my apologies if I missed it in the report. So my last question to the presenter about a way to touch base with the community after the improvements are installed. Is that as part of a future report, once it's built into our base budget, that we would be looking as a process?
Mr. Hagy?
Sorry, I was a bit distracted, but I think the question was, are we...
Consultation of areas that already have the improvements done through the participatory budget of surveying after the improvements.
Yeah, so our intention, even with this one, was to cycle back with them. Obviously, we're not at the point where it's been constructed and we can ask the community, does this meet what you thought you were going to get? But that was our intention with this, these pilots.
So which is good, but would we use that data to enforce of how we bring the final report back of building into the 2020 budget?
Oh, absolutely. If there's a decision to move forward with that, we would look at what we've learned through all stages of the process to inform what we do next.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I just have a couple questions myself. First off, the question I actually asked the delegation, if anyone could comment on that. If this was left to staff, would this park have come in at the $100,000 budget, obviously with fewer amenities? Ms. McGoldrick.
So through the chair, or to the chair, certainly when staff undertake a refurbishment of a park, they look at the full park in terms of all the needs. And so in developing what elements can go in, they go through an iterative process of testing the design against the budget. And so the park works may have been further scoped, but typically, to the very best efforts of staff, they try to work within the budget. I think when you look at the participatory budget process, because each element within the park were discrete items, costs were provided for discrete items, but not necessarily looking at total site works required to make sure that the installation of those elements could occur. So things like additional site works, accessibility, looking at specific elements within the park that needed to be refurbished or removed because of age. That comprehensive look, I think that's something that we can learn from this process in terms of setting costs is instead of looking at, and we do need to assign a cost to each element, but making sure costs associated with overall site design and site features are incorporated.
So just to help my understanding a bit then, so presumably we've done other parks in similar size to these in the not too distant past. Do you have a rough idea of what the budget for those has been?
So through the chair, each park is unique. When we typically look at just replacing, for example, playground structures, again, depending on the number of play bays and elements within that, and the accessibility features that need to be incorporated in. So that's pathway systems looking at the type of surfacing and the unique play elements. We can look at costs ranging between $50,000 to $75,000 for just that play element. So it really depends on what features within the park requires upgrading. Looking at overall, we've seen parks, in the $200,000 to $300,000 range as well. So it's really around appropriate scoping of the needs within a park.
Thank you. Do we know what the additional percentage cost, because I couldn't really find it clearly in the report, but do we know the additional percentage cost that the participatory budgeting cost us through staff time? If we can break out the university portion as well, because I know some of that was for study. What was the additional cost in percentage or dollars total for each of these parks?
So, to the chair, looking at, it was really the iterative engagement process that was more time-consuming in terms of staff time. So when you look at a standard park design, you would normally see engagement costs in around the $10,000 range. The cost of staff time only, and so this would be our design and development landscape architect staff. I don't have costs for other staff involved. It's looking at 4 to 5 times the amount of effort, so likely in and around the $40,000 range for the engagement component.
Would it be possible in time for council to have, I'd like to see a clear breakdown in terms of the additional costs of this process for this park. This would really help me decide where to go on this, including all factors, like if it were done internally, city side, the extra $50,000 in capital aside. I'm just curious in the cost of the process. Is that something you could put together?
Yeah, so certainly from the landscape architect's perspective, we can break down their time because they charge their time as part of capital to each project that they work on. I'm not sure in terms of Mr. Haggie's time and Ms. McDonald's time and any other staff whether we can get to that level of detail. However, likely we can build some assumptions into that estimate.
Okay, and yeah, an estimate, I guess, for that I would be more than happy with. Thank you. Councillor Gazzola.
Yes, just a brief comment. This is a very sexy subject. It's very visionary, and you get this is your first. This is what you get rewards and plaques for. But I have a number of concerns with it. I tried to clarify what the cost is, and from what I'm understanding, it's the cost for the actual, park work was $100,000, but we're looking at an additional $100,000 for this process. So it's a rather expensive proposition. I know public engagement is extremely important. We're always looking to how to improve it. I think we've come a long way in the last 2 or 3 years in improving it. Because there's long been the thought out there that we have public engagement, we go to the public, we ask them what they want, and then when we're all done, we do what we had originally planned to do. But I think we're getting away from that. And I think when we really do get so many things that come up, the public really are satisfied to follow what council does. When there are real, somewhat more serious issues, you can see the kind of public engagement we get. When we talk about the consumption sites, we had this chamber full of people. So when it's an important issue, public engagement is there. So at this point, I will support the recommendation that's in front of us. It's asking, can we refer this to the budget process, at which time I'm sure a staff report will be done on it. But I am skeptical of what it will cost us, because there are only so many dollars to go around. Two or 3 weeks ago, we were here talking about a deficiency in our infrastructure, and that, whether the sun was going to come up in the morning, it's a serious deficiency. Well, we can't do everything. So, as I said, I'll support this stage of it, but it really comes back to the budget that will come back to us for 2020.
Thank you. There are 5 people in the queue. Mayor Rabinovich.
Thanks. So I noted that Councillor Gazzola said he's supportive of the recommendation. I don't know that it's been moved yet. I'm certainly prepared to...
It's been moved by Councillor Marsh.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't hear that earlier. That's great. I certainly will support the recommendation in its present form, because I think we have reached a point now where staff need to take a closer look at it and look at what this might look like going forward. I think there are some opportunities to also look at, sort of participatory budgeting in its purest form, but also look at some of the things that we're already doing with things like the various Love My Hood grants and so on that are available that don't necessarily have a specific dollar associated to a particular neighborhood, but certainly make neighborhood-led projects become possible of various types. And so, maybe there's some blending that can even happen here. That, who knows, maybe we create a new made in Kitchener solution to how PB evolves in the future. So I think this is the right recommendation at this point in time, and that will give staff an opportunity to bring their best recommendations forward to us going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, this is a question. I know there's concerns around the table about the cost of first creating this participatory budgeting model, but could it not be argued that, yes, resources could be increased as we try to make sense of where we're going, but that at the other end, we already do community engagement, which we're not really talking about the cost that already exists for that sort of thing that we do, right? Going out into communities and engaging with people. So I think it would sort of balance out. I think that the startup costs might be noticeable, but once staff has it, has perfected the model, and we're working with it, I think those costs I should phrase this as a question. Would those costs sort of become irrelevant?
Ms. McGoldrick?
So through the chair, certainly, and as Sean had mentioned, as the process becomes more familiar, there's likely efficiencies that can be found. It was a learning process, and so it takes time associated with learning. That being said, the process also is much more engaging, and which, as a direct result, results in more staff time being dedicated to the project, and staff time translates into costs. And so, we might be able to shave some of the staff time associated with, the level of engagement in a PB, participatory budgeting process. But at the end of the day, just the very nature of how participatory the process is does result in more staff time being dedicated to the process.
But then other forms of engagement will be less, right? The way we currently do it will be reduced because more resources are put into the PB. I think as it becomes perfected, I would hope we would allow that to happen before we sort of decide not to go this route. Anyway, I totally will support the motion.
Thank you. Councillor Schneider?
Thank you, Chair Davey. I also will support this. I think it's great value for the tax dollars, and with this pilot, as I admitted in the report, there were some hiccups, but that's to be expected. I mean, we're going to learn along the way and perfect this and get it better and better. I think it actually helped our staff learn more about what residents really want in a park. I think that has a lot of value to it, and I think for we as councillors, doing what our residents want and not what we think they want or what we think they should want brings a lot of value. So I'm happy to see this pilot succeed and look forward to it applied to more processes as well.
Thank you. Councillor Johnston?
Thank you. I think there's such value in this project, and I think that sometimes a community has to be the pioneer and take this on and put the money into it and get the learnings from it. And I'm really excited that the City of Kitchener chose to be that community that did that. And I think that we often are on the leading edge of new ideas and new ways of doing things. Democracy, as I said before, it takes time. Sometimes a little messy, can be a little expensive at first, and maybe we're seeing that. But I do think that we're going to be able to find efficiencies. Again, maybe not having to put as much staff time, being able to look at ways of again, maybe having some lower cost people involved with that. Maybe it is students on different levels. But I think it's really, really important that we move forward with this. And again, I see us being the ones that are doing the pathway for other communities to take a look at this. So I will certainly be supporting the motion.
Thank you. There's no one else in the queue. I'm actually not going to be supporting it at this time. This is one of those times when I'm glad we have a waiting period between now and council, because I may change my vote come council, depending on the numbers I see from staff and some second thoughts. I don't dispute the fact that the end result was probably better than what we would have done on our own. There's no question there. What concerns me is if you were to look at this with a critical eye, of course the results were better. We blew the budget by 50% on the parks that we're building. The process took longer. It requires dedicated staffing resources. And that 50% budget doesn't even include the additional costs of participatory budgeting. I get that there's value in this. I need clarity in terms of the fact that I'm trying to weigh this against, we did 2 parks here. The additional cost is from the overruns in the budget and the staffing costs. We could have done 3 parks from my 1,000-yard perspective. 3 parks that aren't quite as good as the 2 parks that these people have, but it's 3 parks you're serving more people. This is my big concern in participatory budgeting in general, is the efficiency of the process. So I'm going to think about it until the council meeting, but I won't be supporting it at this time. So it's been moved by Councillor Marsh. Those in favor? And opposed? Just myself. Okay, very good. I understand now we are moving into special counsel. Mayor Voinovich.
Call the special council meeting to order. There's 3 items on the agenda. The first item is the noise exemption for the Serbian Food Festival. Somebody want to move that? Moved by Councillor Galloway-Seelock, seconded by Councillor Ioannidis. Any discussion? Sorry, Councillor Gazzola, you asked a question? Oh, no, okay. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Motion to go in camera. Moved by Councillor Singh, seconded by Councillor Schneider. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Motion for 3 readings of the bylaws. Councillor Ioannidis, Councillor Marsh. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Davey, Councillor Schneider. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
I'd like to ask everyone to please take their seats. Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to reconvene this meeting of Finance and Corporate Services. So, Mr. Haggie, anything new in development charges?
Sure. So just like the previous item, staff do not have a presentation. We have Stefan Chechanovic with us from Hemson. He is a new face to some of the newer councillors, this DC study. He was very much involved in our last DC study, so councillors that were here during the last term will recognize Stefan. He has a few opening comments about Bill 108, our DC process, that sort of stuff, and then we'll look to council for question, direction, that sort of stuff.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of council. So you have before you Ryan's report, and I don't intend to sort of go through the details of that report, but suffice to say that a development charge background study was released on April the 25th of this year, and the last time we were before you was on May the 13th, which was the statutory public meeting, which is required prior to the passage of a bylaw. There's been a few changes to the rates that were set out in the background study, a few changes to the growth forecast and some of the capital works that are being funded in the study. And the net effect of all of these changes is that the rates that are before you today are somewhat lower than what was set out in the background study. The other major change, of course, is that on May the 2nd, the province released Bill 108, which, among a lot of other things, makes changes to the Development Charges Act and the Planning Act, which are certainly relevant to the city in respect of DCs. And I won't go into all of the changes that are in that legislation, but there are certainly some new exemptions put into place for secondary suites that will now be mandatory. There are some quite substantive changes to the way the city goes about collecting development charges. And perhaps most significantly of all is the proposed removal of development charges for a number of so-called soft services. The 90% services are now going to be removed from the development charges framework altogether, and there will be a new regime set up under the Planning Act whereby the city can impose a community benefits charge to pay for facilities associated with those services. This is, of course, very relevant to the city because a significant portion of your charge relates to those particular services. There was some confusion over the last couple of weeks as to how municipalities were going to be able to transition their bylaws under this new legislation, and there was some clarity given by the Minister last Friday about this. And suffice to say, we're reasonably confident now that the rates that you see set out in Ryan's report are the rates that can be taken forward. I should say the maximum rates that can be taken forward, because of course you're at your leisure as to what rates you'd like to put into place, as long as they're not higher than those rates that you see in the report. So with that in mind, I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that Council may have. Thank you.
Very good. Just one in the queue at the two now. Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, I just wanted to go over briefly again the big difference between what we had originally talked about and now. Like I got the second one was the way we collect it's going to be a little bit different. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. You mean under the new legislation?
Yes. Or is that what it is? Those are the changes under the new legislation, or changes that from where we were originally?
So, through you, Mr. Chairman, the rates that you have in the staff report are the rates, quote unquote, that are calculated under the old regime and for which you can continue to impose a bylaw for. The new legislation has significant changes put into or being proposed for the way development charges are calculated and paid. So, for example, the development charge that is owed will be frozen for a development at the time somebody applies for their rezoning or their site plan, and then they will pay it at a later date. And for non-residential development and certain forms of residential development, specifically rental housing and non-profit housing, the charge will be paid in annual installments from the date of occupancy of a building. 5 annual installments for all non-residential and rental housing, and 21 annual installments for non-profit housing.
Okay, so I gather that's going to be a cash flow problem. Is that right? So I wondered the magnitude of the problem, of that problem.
So through you, Mr. Chair, we don't know the financial impact of that change for 2 reasons. First of all, we just haven't had the time to look at it. But second of all, the true financial impact is largely dependent on what's in regulations, which have not yet been released, because the regulations will set the basis on which the community benefits charge is calculated. It's going to be calculated on the basis of land value, but we don't know what the prescribed percentage of land value it's going to be. So we just don't know until we hear more.
Okay. I guess the other question I have is on page 5.7, we did make a few changes here. What is the impact of those changes? Does it mean that projects had to be taken out, or on 5.7?
Sorry, Mr. Haggie?
Through the chair, the prices for those projects have been increased slightly, and the rate to recover those has gone up slightly.
So that's it. There were no other adjustments to other, because the price went up there. There were no other projects that fell out.
Correct.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Councillor Singh?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. Obviously, there's quite a bit of changes that are being proposed through Bill 108 that would have some impact on later on the DCs that we're setting. Now, one of them which is DCs on secondary units. The province is saying that we would not be able to charge development charges on secondary units. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Okay, and that's being consolidated within the current bylaw that we would, council would be, or committee and then later council would be approving, or is that something that would have to be adjusted at a later point?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't know the answer to that question, but I have the bylaw in front of me, and I'm just going to, if you can give me a few seconds, and I'll see the list of exemptions. I'm not sure whether a change has been made to precisely bring things into line with the language in the proposed legislation, and I can't remember whether you currently, you have an exemption here for accessory uses to residential uses, so the extent to which that lines up exactly with what's being proposed in Bill 108, I'm not sure, frankly.
Would staff be able to comment?
Mr. Haggie?
Through the chair, I don't believe we've changed the wording in the proposed bylaw to match up with that change from Bill 108.
So
Bill 108 would override anything we have in our bylaw anyway.
Right. So that would have to be amended at a later point then?
I don't think it would, because that Bill 108 legislation and wording would override anything we had in our bylaw.
I see. Okay. All right. So, and that's because it's got royal assent. So technically, it's not that later on there would be any change. It's just it would negate whatever wordage is about those secondary units.
Right. So we could replicate that wording here. Regardless, we'd have to follow what the bill says, if it's specifically worded in our bylaw or not.
I see. Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Marsh.
Yeah, thank you. We've been asked by someone by email whether or not we would consider long-term care facilities being exempted, long-term care and retirement facilities. Has that been addressed in the new Bill 108?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, there's no explicit mention of exemptions or special treatment for those types of development. So that would remain within your area of discretion as to how you want. If you wanted to treat them specially, that would remain within your purview to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so currently we don't really have exemptions to DC charges that I'm aware of, other than for potential deferrals of DCs for affordable housing as an incentive. But do we have any other exemptions?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just looking at Section 2.7 here. So there is a list of exemptions over and above the statutory exemptions. There are exemptions that the city puts into place for temporary uses, accessory uses to residential uses, home business, and agricultural use, temporary buildings, and the enlargement of existing dwelling units, as well as limited exemptions for residential redevelopment as well. But nothing specifically for long-term care facilities.
Okay. Are there precedents in other communities where that's done?
There are, through you, Mr. Chairman. There are municipalities that do exempt long-term care facilities or homes for the aged, institutions that, for lack of a better word, accommodate the needs of older aged adult populations.
And so my last question is just, when in those examples that you're aware of, are there any exemptions for privately owned facilities, or is it all specific to nonprofit owners of the institutions?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I have looked at this in the past, but I'm not sure that I can be definitive about that. I'd have to go and look at it, but happy to do that and get back to you.
I'd love to get a follow-up on email about that to council. Okay.
Certainly, we can commit to that for sure.
Thank you. Councillor Michaud?
Just one question. Could low-income housing be part of the exempt as well? Just like the elder care and stuff that you're just talking about. Could that be, has that been done anywhere? Affordable housing, low-income housing, something like that.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, certainly there have in the past been a number of municipalities who've seen fit to provide exemptions to assist with affordable housing, low-income housing, those sorts of things. I would say the trend has been to move away from using the DSEAM framework to provide that sort of financial assistance, simply because it's a fairly unwieldy tool. You have to make definitions of things here. Your flexibility in applying the incentives is quite narrow. It's very difficult to amend a bylaw if a proposal comes in that doesn't quite fit with what you wanted to provide an incentive for. And finally, there are other avenues for providing that sort of assistance. So there's community improvement planning provisions under the Planning Act that a lot of municipalities find is much more suitable for this, or simply just grants.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, this might be a similar question. Is there a way then, because affordable is sometimes difficult to operationally define, what about adding it in as providing rental housing? Would that be something that's easier to do?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, again, the devil's in the details. So it's a question of whether something is rental or not is a matter of tenure rather than a matter of form, and the development charge is really imposed on the built form of a dwelling. So whether it's a single detached dwelling, whether it's an apartment dwelling, it's something you can see on the ground. So to define the tenure of what's going on in the building is a little bit trickier, and you're relying on people in the building department to make a determination about what the charge is based on the construction plans that they see. So I could foresee some difficulties in trying to provide an exemption based on the nature of the tenure of a building that is not yet built in determining the charge, but certainly there are municipalities that, like I said, who try to provide incentives for this kind of development through these mechanisms. But it's tricky.
Mr. Chapman, do you want to add?
Through the chair, just a point, I don't think it's been made already, is that any exemption that's discretionary, that is one that council elects to make and one that's not required under the Act, has to be funded. And so an example of that is a few years ago when we had a 50% reduction to the industrial development charge rate. We estimated the cost of that over the term of the bylaw to be $1 million, and so council established $1 million in a fund to pay grants, essentially to cover that exemption. So I think the key question to ask is that if you have an interest in supporting long-term care or affordable housing or other uses like that, to the point that's being made, is the best way to fund it through development charges, or if you're going to have to create a fund anyways, to create a fund that's specifically targeting the types of outcomes that you're looking for. I don't think that's a policy decision that can be made here today, likely one that can't be made before the end of June. But I will note that even later today we're starting the conversation around the affordable housing strategy, and so I think that's the best vehicle by which to tackle it. The only other comment I would make is that if I'm correct, Bill 108 does provide relief to affordable housing in that it prescribes a longer payment period for development charges. I believe it was one that was captured into the 20-year time frame. So I don't know, Stefan, if you haven't spoken about that, you may want to touch on it.
Yes, it does. I mean, as Dan mentioned, for rental housing and non-residential development, the payment of a development charge will now be phased over a 5-year period starting at building occupancy, and for non-profit housing, it'll be over a 21-year period starting at occupancy.
So there's that, and there's the no DCs in secondary units, which should also, in theory, help affordable housing. The other question I had, remind me again, what's the percentage, the breakdown percentage between soft and hard services in the DCs?
In the city here?
Yes.
Just going to make sure I have the right schedule, because there's been a few of them that have been floating around. And $539. In the suburban areas of the city, the maximum charge that you could impose for the non-discounted services, that would be the engineered or hard services, would be just short of $8,000 a unit. And for the discounted services or the soft services, it would be $10,800 per unit.
Okay. So we're looking at something like 60% for soft, or in that range.
That's correct.
So the other factor, just because there's been just some discussion about affordable housing, under the proposed regime that's coming forward, the replacement for the DCs is percentage based on land value.
That's correct.
Okay, so presumably then that would lower the DCs on the smaller the unit, the less expensive the house, which should in theory help push towards more affordable housing in principle.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that we can be definitive about that. Certainly, in theory, yes, but we have very little clarity on whether that's going to be a flat prescribed percentage or whether it's going to vary by area within a municipality or across the province. We just don't know, and frankly, I'm not sure that the province is entirely clear about what it wants to do with that. So, I'm not sure that I could.
Okay, no, that's just like anecdotally, that's kind of how I thought it might play out. Do you know offhand if that percentage is based on just the land value or the built unit value?
So it's the land value post-development.
Post-development. Oh, so that would be, okay, so that would be whatever the unit's built. So in the very least then, even if it doesn't shift down more, I mean, I think that it would, but if it doesn't shift down for more, basically more profitable for smaller units and more affordable housing, in the very least, the more expensive units will be paying a higher share than...
In theory, yes.
In theory, okay. I just wanted to clarify that. There are two people for round two. Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, actually, and I wanted to make a comment. I just want to make sure I understand in the recommendation from staff what items 2 and 3 mean. You just... does item number 2 mean if it's a development charge item, we should be paying for it out of there and not going to the taxpayer? Is that what that means?
Future excess capacity? You're talking about the future excess capacity clause in the grant funding one?
Pardon?
In the grant clause?
Yes.
So the grant one's probably the easiest to understand. That's if we get a grant towards something in the DC, when you're calculating things out, you sometimes have to take the grant off the top and then split the costs. We're saying to the extent that we get grants, we assume that that's for our share of the project cost, not to benefit
other stuff.
Right.
Now, is that required or is that a choice that we have?
That's a choice that we have, but it's helpful to explicitly have that. So if we were to move forward with a DC-funded project, that also had a city share to it, we could say, you know, if it was a $10 million project, we get a $500,000 grant. We're saying that we're using that $500,000 towards the city cost, not cutting it down to a $5 million project and splitting the costs.
Okay, that's, and item number, the second item, what is that?
It has to do with, I believe it's with the, for facilities that are being built that may be larger than we need them, that they would be funded by DCs, that we'd be able to recover those costs from DCs.
Okay, recoverable in the future. So
yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I go to Councillor Singh, Mr. Haggie, just I wanted to clarify, so that the grant discussion you're just having, would that include sponsorships as well?
No, but usually the sponsorships are the use of those funds, and the agreements are
incremental,
very specific, and we have control over what those look like. A lot of the time with grants, we don't. It's a program we're applying to, and we're kind of stuck by the rules that the province or the feds or whoever is giving us the grant has. Usually in a sponsorship situation, we're negotiating and discussing what those rules are, what we would use those funds for with the person that's providing us the sponsorship funding.
Okay, but it wouldn't affect, if it's going towards something in our capital forecast that's included in this, it wouldn't affect that. Like, well, I guess what happens, who saves the money?
So usually, in a lot of those cases as well, in a sponsorship, I can't say that word today, sponsorship situation, we are doing something above and beyond what we would plan to do because somebody is giving us sponsor.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you. And because DCs really are the fundamental tool that allows us to provide the necessary infrastructure for growth as well as for community benefits as well. Apart from that, what this community and this council is grappling with this issue is affordable and attainable housing. And DCs being a potential tool, and as Councillor Johnston mentioned regarding rental units. If there are exemptions or other avenues that we could bring about, can we make amendments to our DC bylaw after approval, or does that all have to be captured on the onset of the bylaw?
Mr. Haggie?
Sure. So we've talked a bit about this before. So once we have the bylaw, it's essentially in force until we do a full update. What we've discussed before, and I think Mr. Chapman alluded to, is, and even Stefan, that there's if there are policy decisions that council wants to make to incent affordable housing, that we have those discussions outside of the DC context. So we would still say, here's the DC charge you should pay.
Because as long as they're paid for. So if they're paid for through a different avenue, it really doesn't matter because it's the same bylaw.
Right. And so we would say we have a policy that you don't pay that, but somebody needs to. So we would say we have set aside this amount of money, and so instead of you paying that as the developer, it's coming from this pot that's been set aside by council to pay DCs for affordable housing.
I see. Okay. All right. Thank you. Oh, actually, further, because Stephanie, you were asked a question about rental, and so apart from having a different pot that could ultimately pay for it, looking at an exemption, now is the opportunity to have a discussion of having a reduction for specific prescribed use, like rental. And you said it's tough to do because you can't really determine what the tenure will be of that unit. Now, is that absolutely, what I'm trying to say is, are there not avenues for us to be able to determine? Simply, if the ownership continues to be in the whoever the developer's name is, likely chances it's a rental unit as opposed to someone building it and quickly selling to someone else. So if you were to place in a time period that there has to remain whoever built it and they could use it, and our hope would be that it is for a rental purpose, that we could look at or consider at this opportunity to see if we want to provide reduction to rental units so that we can increase the supply of rental, in effect, hope for reduction of the rental market rents.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, I certainly don't want to imply that it's impossible to do. It's certainly something you could do. The points I wanted to make was that municipalities who have done it have found it administratively difficult. They've started to move away from the DC framework to provide these sorts of incentives because there are other better tools available for providing these sorts of incentives. And then finally, as Mr. Chapman mentioned, these are costs that you have to incur. And so anytime you elect to provide this sort of incentive, you are going to have to find some other funding source in order to pay for the offsetting revenue, and that's almost certainly going to have to be your property taxes or your utility rates.
But how so, though? Because we are currently providing an incentive for central neighborhoods. DC's development in central neighborhoods is at a lesser rate than it is in suburban. So could we not apply something similar to a unit that is a rental? We're supposedly assuming that it would be a rental as opposed to something that's being built for consumption of to be sold off to another party.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't describe the lower rate that applies in the central neighborhood as an incentive. It's a lower rate because it reflects the lower cost of providing infrastructure to those areas. The higher rate in the suburban area reflects the fact that there's more infrastructure there, principally engineered infrastructure there, that's required for those neighborhoods.
So legislatively, we are allowed to do that?
That's correct.
Legislatively, we are not allowed to discount based on usage?
What you can't do, Mr. Chair, is you can't discount the central neighborhoods and apply a higher rate to the suburban areas to offset that discount. You can't do that. You have to be made whole by some other funding source that's outside the development charge framework.
It comes back to the initial discussion that we would have to have outside of the DC bylaw. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Gazzola, your comment or a question? Comments? Okay. Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to development charges for affordable housing. So the tools we have outside of development charges are things like inclusionary zoning, which won't come into effect, if it ever does, until a year and a half down the road. I guess this might be for staff, but what other tools do we have that aren't going to cost the city money? Well, seriously, because we don't really, right? And this is a tool that we could actually use right now.
I'll allow the question, but we are, I think, just be careful too that we're not straying outside.
What's wrong with that question? No, I'm serious.
No, I'm just saying it's an affordable housing question, but it's
right. But if we don't put this in the bylaw, in the development charges bylaw right now, you're saying we can't amend it later.
Okay, Mr. Chapman.
Through the chair, the point I was trying to make earlier is that this is actually a very expensive tool to incent affordable housing because the legislation requires that if we provide a discretionary exemption, which this would be, we have to fund it from some other source. So we would have to create a fund that every time an affordable housing project comes in, the city, the taxpayer, would pay the development charges on that project. And so it's not free at all. Any exemption that you approve has a cost. All my point is that through the housing work that we do, if council ultimately decides that you want to provide DC exemptions for affordable housing, you can do that, and it will be the same mechanism. You'll establish a fund, and when an application comes forward, you'll fund it. What I would suggest, though, is this is a pretty blunt tool. I think it's far better to be very clear about what kind of affordable housing and where, to what quality, what standard, what income level you want, and then target significant funding to incentivize that. This instrument is not the right instrument to do that.
But can you not, you wouldn't be waiving the development charges for the whole building. If a developer put 3 units of affordable housing, which of course has to be defined, into that build, then only those 3 units would be exempt, right? Isn't that how development charges, aren't they per unit?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I don't see anything wrong with the concept you're describing. I mean, if it's a 100-unit building and there's 3 units in it that are affordable, and provided you can reasonably come up with a definition that only picks up those 3 units, then I don't see why, in theory, you couldn't provide that exemption. I think Mr. Chapman's point I agree with, though, is that you can still do that through other means. You don't have to do that through this process, and there are, in fact, challenges that municipalities have found by doing it through this process. I note that if you are, in fact, undertaking an affordable housing strategy soon, and that strategy, for example, comes back with a clear recommendation that the development charge framework is the right way to go, there is a mechanism for amending your bylaw.
Oh, there is.
So, I mean, it's not straightforward. You have to undertake a background study for, not this kind of background study, but you'd have to release a study related to that exemption, and you'd have to hold a public meeting. But certainly there is a mechanism under the Act to amend your bylaw over the next 5 years, if that's the way you want to proceed.
Can I just ask staff then, is the inclusionary zoning review that we're doing right now, would that suffice for a development charge exemption per unit at a later date if we decided to do that?
Mr. Reedman.
Through the chair, the work that we do will provide a lot of the background. We do have to define what affordability means in terms of the Kitchener context, so that will be included in this work. There may be implementation measures that would have to be done separately, such as this, but that would come forward in the future report.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there's no one. Mayor Rabinovich, question?
No, I just wanted to maybe sort of get a sense of some additional clarity to what Mr. Chapman was saying on this issue, because if we do it as part of the you can correct me if I'm wrong here, if we do it as part of the development charge bylaw, and let's say there's 100 units that we exempt, and we'll just for the sake of we'll say 20,000 is the amount that we're talking about, then we would need to fund that $2 million from the general tax base. And it would be for all affordable housing, correct? We could do the exact same thing as we go through our affordable housing work and say, well, the stuff that we want to in particular focus our energy on is supportive housing and housing that is subsidized to the tune of at least 50% of rents. And those are the only ones we want to do, and that might mean half the number of units, but we could target it, and we would still need to set aside the same amount of money, but be very targeted and specific about it, correct?
Mr. Chapman?
That's exactly right, and I think we experienced that with the downtown exemption, that there was a sense over time that if we could do it again, to be able to set higher standards around who qualified for a downtown exemption might have been in the city's interest around urban design or other amenities. That opportunity is now past us, but I think we have the same opportunity with affordable housing to get it right and set a high standard.
Right.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Gallagher, see that question?
Do you have a mover of the recommendation yet?
We do not.
I would like to move the
Very
recommendation.
good. Question as well, or just?
No, that was my question.
That was going to be my next question, so thank you for that.
I have comments at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you. If you wouldn't mind queuing back and just have Councillor Gazzola ahead of you. Councillor Gazzola, comments?
Pardon?
Comments. Thank you for coming in. Appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I was going to try and move it. But speaking to the recommendation, I'm totally in support of the recommendation that's come forward from staff. I do want to mention that I've seen a number of these bylaws over the years, and I think we're getting better and better every time we do another one. We've got the best, I really think the best outside consulting staff dealing with this issue, and with Hempson. Our staff have become very knowledgeable over the years, and they have brought us bylaws that we haven't had a lot of problems with. So I really am fully support of where we're going. I'm not in support of using this tool for providing exemptions. The bottom line with DC charges is that I believe growth should pay for growth. Once we start getting into exemptions, that there's no magic here. There's no funds out there. You either pay for it through development charges, or the taxpayer, the old taxpayer that's been there, has to pay for it. So I'm not opposed to supporting helping affordable housing. I'm not opposed to these helping other things that have problems. But I think the best way to do it is through a separate program. To me, there's a lot more transparency there in that we know what we are actually spending on those programs that is coming out of the taxpayer's pocket. If I ask right now, what did that exemption for the downtown, that's been buried. We really don't, that doesn't stick out. It's just a routine. When it's built into the DC charges, it just goes through, and there's really not a great deal of consideration at the time. So, as I say, I'm not opposed. There's a lot we can do with affordable housing, but this is not the tool to do it with. I think staff have rightly so mentioned that we can get the funding we require, and it's going to come from the taxpayer, but putting it in here, the administrative costs get a lot higher. If you start going back and appealing, then you have to do studies again. So the road is not easy. It can be accomplished, but not, in my opinion, through this tool. I think we have a tremendous product here, and I want to favor going ahead with what we've got. I understand we have the option of sticking with the old bylaw that we have in place, or we have the option here to move forward. I think we've done our work, we've done our homework well. I think we can defend what we have here, and I think in the end, the entire community is the winner. So I think we need to move ahead where we're at. So those are my comments. At the end, of course, I'd like a recorded vote.
Very good, thank you. Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, actually on page 523, section 2.7, there's a whole list of exemptions. So are you suggesting we should take them all out? I don't think so. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Galway-Seelock.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to say that I support the direction of staff with regards to the development charge bylaw review. I think it's important for us to continue to move forward, even though it is a little bit of higher rates than normal. But there's a reason why it's a little bit higher, is we did discover that we were undercharging in the past bylaws. So I think it's important for us to continue to move forward. It's also no surprise to anybody that the soft services are important, especially for Ward 5 and some of the growing areas of the city, including some of the other community centers that are online. And I think it's been a long time that growth has exceeded what we've been able to do in growing parts of the city. And so it's finally time to put those services in for the residents of the Southwest area and make sure that they have the same facilities that have been a benefit to other communities within the city. And so I think that we need to continue to move forward, and we need to just watch what's happening at the provincial level and follow along with that. But in the meantime, I think it's prudent upon us to continue to move forward with the new DC bylaw.
Mayor Rabinovich?
Thank you. Just very briefly, I too will be supporting this for many of the reasons outlined. I think it's clear from the work that has been done, both by staff and the consultant, that the charges that are proposed here are necessary for the growth that's happening in our community. And as Councillor Galway-Seelock just indicated, we know that the Southwest is been very patiently waiting for virtually any sort of amenities in that neighborhood. And this will certainly take us some steps, some significant steps in the right direction in that regard. I think the other important thing to remember is that I think, in this city, we have a history, and quite frankly, both in this city and in this region, of being very reasonable, and some could maybe even argue being too reasonable in terms of making sure that growth paid for growth. And unlike some of the problems that we know have happened in some communities in the province, particularly as it related to Section 37 and this notion of pay to play and other charges that were levied against development. We've never gone down that path. We've always been based our fees on very real numbers and very real recommendations, and I think this continues to do that. And hopefully whatever changes we ultimately end up seeing from the province will make sure that we stay whole. I know that is something that in conversations with ministry officials, including the minister, they've made those commitments. And as we go forward, as we move to the new regimen around soft services, that's something that we're going to be looking for and expecting. My final point, just speaking to some of the questions that Councillor Chapman raised around affordable housing. I think there is a place for us to look at subsidies and so on, but outside of the context of the bylaw. It essentially will mean the same thing. We're going to have to fund it from the broader tax base, but I think that is a discussion to have in the context of affordable housing and deal with it in that realm.
Thank you. I'll be supporting as well. I think Kitchener is fortunately at a point now where we've been, I think, pushing the snowball up the hill for several years, and now starting to roll down the other side in terms of we can actually probably charge these higher fees without fear of development coming to a standstill. I am still a little bit concerned because the quantum is significant here, but I guess that will bear itself out. On the development, on the affordable housing portion, I'll echo Mayor Verbenovic's comments in that whatever the province does, we need to be made whole at the end of the day. But I will say I'm actually in agreement with the idea of charging development fees based on a percentage of the house's value. That is a more progressive way for growth to pay for growth than the way it is now, where we have an undue burden on the smaller units that people can barely afford in the first place. So even if that doesn't necessarily translate to lower cost in the first place, I think it will most certainly translate into more units built, which is also we're near crisis mode in terms of rental affordability and smaller unit affordability in this region. So I will support, and we hope we all keep our fingers crossed and do more than that and advocate for being kept whole whenever the province comes out with the finer details. With that, it's been moved by Councillor Galway-Seelock, and a recorded vote has been called. And that carries unanimously. We will take a 2-minute break while we switch over the system for the last part of this committee.